Imagine waking up tomorrow with 10 times more money than you have today. Now imagine losing every dollar within 5 years. As strange as it sounds, that's exactly what happens to countless lottery winners, professional athletes, celebrities, and entrepreneurs. Some earn millions, many end up bankrupt. The obvious explanation is bad luck. The uncomfortable explanation is something else. Maybe money isn't the real problem. Maybe the person holding it is. For decades, we've been told that the biggest obstacle to wealth is opportunity. If only I had better connections. If only I earned more. If only I had richer parents. If only someone gave me a chance. And while those things absolutely matter, they don't explain one uncomfortable pattern that repeats itself across history. Some people inherit fortunes and lose everything. Others begin with almost nothing and slowly build lasting prosperity. Same economy, different outcome. Why psychologists have spent years studying financial behavior. Economists analyze markets. Entrepreneurs write books promising formulas for success. Yet one of the oldest collections of wisdom ever written identified many of the same patterns thousands of years before modern finance even existed. Not through investment advice, not through stock market predictions, but through stories. Stories about kings, farmers, builders, merchants, servants, dreamers, and ordinary people making extraordinary decisions. The remarkable part isn't that these stories are ancient. It's that they describe people who look surprisingly familiar, people who chased status instead of substance, people who confused income with wealth, people who mistook consumption for success, people who believed tomorrow would somehow solve problems they refused to confront today. In other words, people like us. Here's the twist. This documentary isn't about getting rich. It isn't about promising financial miracles. And it certainly isn't about claiming the Bible contains secret investment formulas. Instead, we're going to treat these ancient narratives the way elite business schools study historical leaders, as case studies in decision-making, stewardship, character, delayed gratification, risk, and human behavior. Because every financial decision begins long before money enters the picture. It begins in the mind. And that's where one ancient writer made an observation that feels almost unsettling today. He noticed that two people could possess the same opportunities, yet produce radically different outcomes, not because of talent alone, but because of the habits they practiced every single day. Modern neuroscience now tells us that repeated habits physically reshape the brain. Behavioral economists say our financial lives are driven less by logic than by invisible biases. Long before either field existed, Scripture repeatedly portrayed wealth as the visible result of invisible patterns, not guaranteed outcomes, patterns. That distinction changes everything, because if patterns create outcomes, then perhaps being broke isn't always just about a lack of money. Perhaps it's also about the systems we repeat without realizing. And that's where one of the Bible's most overlooked stories quietly begins, not in a palace, not in a marketplace, but in a garden. A place where abundance was normal, where scarcity didn't yet exist, where humanity faced a decision that had nothing to do with money, yet everything to do with stewardship. And hidden inside that decision is a principle that still shapes businesses, careers, investments, and entire economies today. But before we get there, there's another question we have to answer first. Why do intelligent people consistently make decisions they know they'll regret? Because once you understand that, you'll never look at your finances the same way again. Every civilization eventually asks the same question. Why do some societies flourish while others collapse? Historians usually point to wars, politics, natural resources, technology. All of those matter. But beneath every rise and every fall lies something less obvious: human choices. Empires don't disappear overnight. Businesses don't suddenly fail. Families rarely wake up bankrupt for no reason. Most collapses begin quietly, with small decisions repeated over months or years until the consequences become impossible to ignore. That's true for nations, it's true for companies, and it's true for individuals. One of the Bible's earliest narratives opens in a world defined by abundance rather than lack. The opening chapters of Genesis describe a garden where every essential need is already provided. Food is available, purpose is clear. Work exists before hardship. That last point often surprises people. Work wasn't introduced as a punishment. Humanity is instructed to cultivate and care for the garden before the fall. The assignment isn't survival, it's stewardship. That single distinction carries enormous implications. Stewardship assumes ownership belongs to someone else. Management requires responsibility. Abundance demands discipline. Modern business operates on exactly the same principle. A CEO doesn't own every asset under management. A fund manager invests capital entrusted by others. A leader succeeds by multiplying what has been placed in their care. The biblical narrative introduces this idea before governments, corporations, or financial systems ever appear. It's a worldview built on responsibility rather than entitlement. Then something changes. A question enters the story. Did God really say? First glance, it appears to be a theological conversation. Look closer, and it becomes something far more familiar. It's a challenge to boundaries. Every financial disaster begins with a similar whisper. One purchase won't matter. Shortcut won't hurt. Deserve this. Fix it later. It'll all work out. Language changes. The psychology doesn't. Behavioral scientists describe something called present bias, the tendency to value immediate rewards far more than future consequences. That's why people struggle to save for retirement. Why businesses chase quarterly profits at the expense of long-term stability. Why consumers accumulate debt for possessions that lose value almost immediately. The temptation in Eden follows the same psychological pattern, an immediate gain, a distant consequence. The fruit isn't merely attractive, it's desirable because it promises something beyond itself. Wisdom, status, control, a shortcut. Isn't that what almost every financial scam promises? Get rich quickly, skip the process, ignore the fundamentals, reach the destination without becoming the person capable of sustaining it. History repeats this cycle endlessly. From speculative bubbles to fraudulent investment schemes, the attraction isn't simply money, it's speed. The faster the promise, the stronger the temptation. But Genesis quietly presents a different framework: growth before possession, responsibility before expansion, character before influence. It's not glamorous. It doesn't sell online courses. It doesn't generate viral headlines. But it explains why some people can inherit massive opportunity and still lose everything. Because opportunity amplifies character. It doesn't replace it. Think about that for a moment. Money magnifies, leadership magnifies, influence magnifies. If discipline already exists, greater resources usually increase impact. If chaos already exists, greater resources often multiply destruction. The ancient story isn't merely explaining humanity's origin. It's introducing a principle that echoes throughout every page that follows. External success cannot permanently outrun internal maturity. That idea will surface again and again. In kings who inherit kingdoms they cannot manage. In merchants who mistake profit for wisdom. In leaders who gain power before developing self-control. And eventually, in one young man sold into slavery who demonstrates a financial mindset long before he ever manages wealth. His name is Joseph. Most people remember him because of dreams. Very few notice why entire nations eventually trusted him with unimaginable resources. That wasn't because of his visions. It was because of something much harder to build. And that's where our story takes its first unexpected turn. History usually celebrates the moment someone reaches the top, the promotion, the billion-dollar valuation, the championship, the crown. But almost nobody pays attention to the years that came before. The years when nobody was watching. The years when character was being built instead of reputation. That's where one of the Bible's most remarkable stories begins, not with success, but with betrayal. Joseph was 17 years old when his life changed forever. He was ambitious, confident, and gifted. He also had something that made him deeply unpopular. His father openly favored him above his brothers. Family tension slowly became resentment. Resentment became hatred. Hatred became a plan. One ordinary day, Joseph walked toward his brothers expecting a normal conversation. Instead, he found a conspiracy. Within hours, he was thrown into a dry pit, then sold to traveling merchants. His freedom was exchanged for silver. His future disappeared into the desert. Imagine the psychological impact. One week you're part of a wealthy household, the next you're someone's property. Most people would conclude that life had become unfair. Many would stop trying altogether. Joseph didn't. That's the first lesson hidden beneath the surface. Circumstances influence us. They don't have to define us. When Joseph arrived in Egypt, he owned nothing. No family, no influence, no reputation, no legal rights, no financial assets. Yet the biblical account repeatedly describes something unusual. Whatever responsibility Joseph received, he handled well. At first it wasn't money, it was ordinary work, small assignments, daily responsibilities. The kind of work ambitious people often dismiss because it seems too insignificant. Modern psychology calls this the competence loop. When people consistently complete small responsibilities well, they build confidence, trust, and capability that naturally lead to greater opportunities. Businesses work exactly the same way. Very few CEOs begin by leading multinational organizations. Most first prove they can manage a single project, a small team, a department, one client's account. Growth usually follows demonstrated stewardship, not demanded promotion. Joseph's master began noticing something difficult to ignore. Everything Joseph managed improved. Operations became more organized. Resources were handled wisely. Trust increased. Eventually, Joseph wasn't simply another servant. He became the manager of the entire household. Think about what that means. He still didn't own the estate, but he learned how to run one. That distinction matters. Some people spend years complaining that they don't own more. Others spend those same years mastering whatever has already been placed in their hands. The second group is quietly preparing for opportunities the first group will never recognize. Then, everything collapsed again. A false accusation, a rushed judgment, a prison sentence. Years of progress disappeared overnight, or so it seemed. Here's where the story becomes extraordinary. Joseph didn't treat prison as the end of his purpose. He treated it as another place to practice excellence. The prison wasn't fair, it wasn't deserved, but it was real. And reality always demands a response. Notice what Scripture emphasizes. It doesn't say Joseph complained until conditions improved. It doesn't describe him waiting for motivation. Instead, the same pattern appears again: responsibility, reliability, trust. Eventually, even the prison warden placed Joseph in charge of other prisoners. Read that again. A prisoner managing a prison. That's almost unbelievable. Yet it's perfectly consistent with one timeless principle. Leadership is often recognized before it is officially rewarded. The title usually comes later. Character comes first. This is where modern careers often break down. Many people want authority before accountability, recognition before consistency, influence before discipline. But sustainable success almost always grows in the opposite direction. The invisible work creates the visible opportunity. That's true whether you're building a business, managing investments, leading a family, or developing a career. The habits nobody applauds become the foundation everyone notices later. Joseph couldn't control betrayal. He couldn't control slavery. He couldn't control prison. But he could control how faithfully he responded to each season. That mindset didn't eliminate suffering. It positioned him for the moment that would change history, because somewhere beyond those prison walls, Egypt's most powerful ruler was having dreams that no one could explain. The greatest economic crisis of the ancient world was quietly approaching. No economist saw it, no advisor understood it, no magician could interpret it, but one forgotten prisoner held the key. And within a matter of hours, everything would change. History rarely remembers the years when everything seemed ordinary. People remember crashes, they remember recessions, they remember famine, they remember the day everything changed. What they often forget is that every crisis casts a shadow long before it arrives. The warning signs are usually there. Most people simply don't recognize them. Some ignore them. Others assume someone else will solve the problem. Ancient Egypt stood on the edge of exactly that kind of moment. Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the region, was deeply disturbed by two dreams that refused to leave his mind. 7 healthy cows were swallowed by 7 thin, starving cows. 7 full heads of grain were consumed by 7 withered ones. None of his advisors could explain them, not because they lacked intelligence, Because they lacked perspective. Then someone remembered a forgotten prisoner, Joseph. Within hours, a man who had spent years behind bars was standing before the ruler of the greatest economic power in the ancient world. Notice something remarkable. Joseph didn't begin with self-promotion. He didn't market himself as a genius. He didn't use the moment to settle old scores or impress the room. Instead, he pointed beyond himself and calmly interpreted the dreams. The message was simple, but devastating. 7 years of extraordinary abundance would be followed by 7 years of catastrophic famine. The abundance wasn't the blessing. It was the preparation period. That single insight changed history. Most people think wealth is created during good times. Joseph understood something different. Wealth is often preserved or lost. During good times, anyone can spend when money is flowing. Anyone can feel confident when business is booming. The real test isn't what you do during scarcity. It's what you do during abundance. Instead of merely identifying the problem, Joseph proposed a strategy. Store a portion of the harvest during the prosperous years. Build reserves. Create systems. Prepare before preparation feels necessary. That advice sounds almost obvious, yet history shows how rarely people follow it. Economic booms often create overconfidence. Businesses expand too quickly. Families increase lifestyles as fast as income rises. Investors mistake temporary success for permanent security. Psychologists call this optimism bias. The tendency to believe that today's favorable conditions will continue indefinitely. The Bible presents the same human tendency through narrative rather than theory. Joseph recognized that abundance has a hidden danger. It convinces people they no longer need discipline. That's why his plan wasn't merely about grain. It was about self-control. For 7 years, Egypt stored rather than consumed, prepared rather than celebrated, built rather than boasted. Imagine how difficult that must have been. Harvests were plentiful. People probably questioned why so much was being stored. Some may have thought Joseph was overly cautious. Others likely believed those resources should be enjoyed immediately. But leadership often requires making unpopular decisions today to protect people tomorrow. That's a principle every entrepreneur eventually learns. The most dangerous season for a business isn't always the downturn. Sometimes it's rapid growth. Growth can hide inefficiency. Easy profits can conceal poor systems. Strong sales can mask weak financial discipline. Then the market changes. And suddenly, what looked like success is exposed as fragility. Joseph refused to confuse a good season with a permanent reality. He built margin. Margin isn't exciting. It doesn't generate headlines. It doesn't impress people on social media. But margin creates resilience. Whether it's financial savings, emotional health, trusted relationships, or operational systems, margin allows people to withstand pressure without collapsing. Then the famine arrived, exactly as predicted. Fields that once produced abundance became barren, food became scarce, panic spread across nations. But Egypt was ready, not because they escaped the crisis, because they prepared for it. People from surrounding countries traveled to Egypt seeking food. Resources that had once seemed excessive suddenly became essential. Preparation became influence. Stewardship became leadership. The nation that planned wisely became the nation others depended upon. That's an extraordinary inversion. Joseph never chased influence. He built competence. Influence followed. This pattern repeats throughout history. Organizations that survive recessions are often those that resisted unnecessary excess during prosperity. Investors who remain calm during market volatility are often those who planned before emotions took over. Families that weather unexpected hardships usually aren't the luckiest. They're often the most prepared. None of this guarantees wealth. Life remains unpredictable. Unexpected setbacks happen. Markets fluctuate. Illness strikes. Circumstances change. The Bible never presents wisdom as a guarantee against suffering. It presents wisdom as a better way to navigate uncertainty. Joseph's story illustrates exactly that. He couldn't control the famine. He couldn't prevent economic hardship. But he could influence how people responded once it arrived. That distinction is crucial. Control is limited. Responsibility is not. Perhaps that's the deepest financial lesson hidden in this ancient account. Too much energy is spent worrying about factors beyond our influence. Too little is spent mastering the decisions already within our reach. Income matters, opportunity matters, education matters. But beneath all of them lies something even more fundamental: daily choices, repeated consistently over years. The choice to learn instead of merely consume, to save before spending, to build skills before demanding rewards, to value character as highly as competence, to prepare while others postpone. None of those decisions feel dramatic in the moment, yet over decades they compound, just as interest compounds, just as habits compound, just as wisdom compounds. And perhaps that's why Joseph's legacy isn't remembered because he became wealthy. It's remembered because when an entire civilization faced collapse, they entrusted their future to someone who had spent years proving he could faithfully manage what belonged to someone else. The greatest asset Joseph ever possessed wasn't grain. It wasn't political authority. It wasn't influence. It was trust. And trust, earned slowly, tested repeatedly, and guarded carefully, remains one of the most valuable forms of capital any leader, entrepreneur, or individual can ever build. If you've made it this far, you may have noticed something surprising. This was never really a story about money. Money was simply the mirror. The real story has always been about decisions. The modern world constantly tells us that wealth begins with a bigger paycheck. The biblical narrative repeatedly points somewhere deeper. It begins with stewardship. That doesn't mean everyone who is wise becomes wealthy. The Bible never promises that. In fact, many of its most faithful people endured hardship, persecution, and loss. But it does suggest something profoundly practical. The habits that help people manage little are often the same habits required to manage much. That's a principle echoed by economists, psychologists, business leaders, and investors alike. Think back through Joseph's life. He didn't become trustworthy after he gained power. He gained power because he had already become trustworthy. He didn't suddenly develop discipline when Pharaoh promoted him. That discipline had been forged in places no one celebrated, in a servant's quarters, in a prison, in years that looked from the outside like failure. Our culture is fascinated by outcomes. Scripture pays remarkable attention to process. That's an uncomfortable truth, because outcomes are exciting. Process is repetitive. Outcomes earn applause. Process often goes unnoticed. Yet nearly everything of lasting value is built through repetition. Businesses grow through repeated service. Investments grow through repeated contributions. Strong marriages grow through repeated acts of commitment. Character grows through repeated choices that nobody else sees. The question then isn't simply, why am I still broke? A more revealing question might be what patterns am I repeating? Because patterns have consequences. Spend slightly more than you earn every month and debt quietly compounds. Learn consistently for 5 years and knowledge compounds. Invest patiently over decades and time compounds. Neglect your health, your relationships, or your integrity, and those consequences compound too. Compounding isn't just a financial principle. It's a principle of life. One decision rarely changes everything. Thousands of small decisions often do. That's why Proverbs speak so often about diligence, wisdom, self-control, and planning, not as shortcuts to riches, but as foundations for a stable life. The ancient writers understood something that modern neuroscience continues to confirm. We become what we repeatedly practice. Your calendar shapes your future. Your habits shape your character. Your character shapes your decisions. And your decisions shape your life. This doesn't remove the reality of injustice. Some people begin life with enormous advantages. Others face obstacles they never chose. Economic inequality is real. Unexpected tragedy is real. Discrimination, illness, war, and recession can alter the course of a person's life through no fault of their own. The Bible never ignores those realities. Instead, it consistently asks a different question. What will you do with what has been placed in your hands today? That's the question Joseph answered, not once, hundreds of times, when he managed a household, when he organized a prison, when he advised Pharaoh, when he administered food during a famine. Every stage looked different. The principle remained the same: faithfulness before expansion, responsibility before authority, preparation before opportunity. Perhaps that's why so many people miss the most important lesson. They're waiting for a breakthrough while neglecting the habits that would allow them to sustain one. Because opportunity can change your income overnight. But only character can determine what happens after that. History is full of people who made fortunes and lost them. It's also full of people who quietly built lasting influence, not because they chased wealth, but because they became the kind of people others could trust. And trust has a remarkable way of opening doors that talent alone cannot. So if you're asking why you're still broke, maybe the answer isn't found in your bank account. Maybe it's found in your routines, your priorities, your willingness to delay gratification, your commitment to learning, your ability to finish what you start, your relationship with responsibility. Those are not glamorous answers. They don't promise overnight transformation, but they have something far more valuable. They have stood the test of thousands of years, long before business schools, long before financial influencers, long before economic theories. These ancient stories preserved a simple observation about human nature. People don't drift toward wisdom, they drift toward comfort. Wisdom must be chosen again and again, day after day, year after year. And perhaps that's why these stories still matter. Not because they reveal a secret formula for becoming rich, but because they expose the invisible patterns that often determine whether success lasts or disappears as quickly as it arrived. The next time you read one of these ancient accounts, don't ask only, "What happened?" Ask a different question. ***, what pattern is this story trying to reveal? ***, because once you begin seeing those patterns, you start recognizing them everywhere, in business, in leadership, in relationships, and in your own life. And one of the most misunderstood patterns in Scripture may be even more relevant today. It isn't about money. It isn't about power. It's about the rise and fall of a king whose greatest enemy wasn't an army. It was his own success. And that story might explain why achievement can become more dangerous than failure.